From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. In January, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, Switchyard organized a gathering of journalists from across the country to discuss how we would go about covering the new administration. We gathered together the biographers of Michelle Obama and Mitch McConnell, authors of books about the Koch brothers and the family, about Amazon and Google and Facebook, about the rise of white supremacy and the cash value of racism. We featured writers and editors for the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones. For StoryCorps, This American Life, and Reveal. We also had musicians, filmmakers, novelists, essayists, and poets. As we had hoped, the gathering was a source of solace, a call to action and a chance to recommit ourselves to our values and best practices, and a rekindling of our belief in the power of storytelling in all its forms. In these unprecedented and difficult times, we are once again reporting on a president who characterizes journalists as enemies of the state and jokes about killing us. And he empowers and emboldens state and local officials to indulge their most authoritarian impulses. Here in the heart of Tulsa, on the grounds of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the end of the Trail of Tears, we have state officials who have sought to block the teaching of that history while requiring schools to buy Bibles branded with the new president's name. The solemn question each of our panels addressed: what are we going to do now? In this live episode about the role of literature in a new era of political division, Jennifer Son leads a conversation with Cynthia Banu, Michael Crowley, Donovan Hone, and Antonio Ruiz Camacho. Jennifer is the editor-in-chief of High Country News, a magazine about the American West. Our panelists are Cynthia Banu, author of the short story collection Seeking Fortune Elsewhere, Michael Crowley, the author of the story collection Any Other Place, Donovan Hone, the author of the essay collection The Inner Coast and also the book Moby Duck, and Antonio Ruiz Camacho, author of the story collection Barefoot Dogs.
My name's Cynthia Banu. It's great to be here. I am a professor of creative writing at Oregon State University. During the 2016 election, I was a first-year MFA student, and I now have students of my own, and that's what I'm thinking about. I'm both a journalist and a fiction writer. I'm frequently asked about these parallel paths that I pursued. Why one? Why the other? What is the value of each? I don't do as much reporting as I used to, but I rely on accurate, thorough journalism in order to learn about what is happening in the world and to make decisions. Decisions that affect my life, my family's life, my community, and broader society. The role of literature is trickier for me to speak about because in the end, both the consumption of and the making of fiction is a mysterious process for me. Reading a good story is more akin to listening to a magnificent piece of music than it is to reading an article in the newspaper. Sometimes it's about meaning, but always it's about feeling. What I do know is that literature is a powerful tool. The simple act of telling a story is a form of resistance. It is a quiet demand. The writer asks the reader to take a break and to pay attention to something unknown and unfamiliar. My own fiction centers the lives of immigrant families. My parents are immigrants from India, and I was born while my father was a graduate student in Philadelphia. I was born at Penn Hospital and issued a birth certificate by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. A few days ago, our new president signed an executive order called Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship. Under this order, I would not be considered a United States citizen because when I was born, my mother was in the country on a temporary visa, and my father was not yet a permanent resident. If this order were in place 40 years ago, many of the stories in my book, Seeking Fortune Elsewhere, would look very different. I don't know what the future holds, but I see it as my job to write down the stories and capture the particular aspects of the human experience that I am most tuned into and concerned about. Through fiction, what I am actually doing is requesting a pause. Look, these are people. They experience joy and sorrow and heartache. They are not just like you, but they are also not so different. This is so simple, and yet it is clear that we need the reminder. During the 2016 presidential election, I was an MFA student studying under the great Elizabeth McCracken. The election was on November 8th. She emailed us on the morning of November 9th. One of the essential things art can do is to imagine, to describe, to perform extraordinary acts of empathy to explain the inexplicable, she wrote. She added, the work of literature is to empathize. We cannot give it up. It's 2025 now, and we still cannot give it up. In a chaotic world, writing is a refuge. Writing provides me with a quiet space, and in that quiet space, I can think, I can line up words into sentences, and tell a story. Look, it lets me say, look at these people in my story. They experience joy and sorrow and heartache. They are not just like you, but are they really so different?
Hi, my name's Michael Crowley. I teach fiction at Denison University outside Columbus, Ohio. I'm a fiction writer and essayist and sometimes sports writer. Before my talk, we're actually going to watch a clip from the movie HUD. And then after that, I'll read this little thing I wrote to accompany it.
Hey, Granddad.
All right, he's got your crumb. What else is he giving you a taste for?
All we have is a couple of drinks, is all. I don't remember you being a teetotaler.
I drink. I don't object to his having whiskey.
Well, something seems to be eating away at your liver.
You, Hud. Like always.
Hey, what are you clamming around hunting for?
You think a lot of Hud, do you? You think he's a real man while you're being tucked in.
You listen to him, Anjo. He's my daddy, and he knows.
I know you. You're smart. You got your share of guts. You can talk a man into trusting you. And a woman into one.
Then I got it made, ain't I?
To hear you tell
Why don't you get it off your chest? Griping you all this time with what I've done to Norman.
you were drunk and careless of your brother.
You had 15 years to get over it. That's half of my life.
That's not our quarrel and never has been.
What the hell it isn't.
No, boy. I was sick of you a long time before that.
Well, isn't life full of surprises? And all along I thought it was what I'd done to my big brother.
I took that hard, but I buried it.
Well, all right, I'll bite what turned you sour on me, not that I give a damn.
Just that, Hud. You don't give a damn. That's all. That's the whole of it. You still don't get it, do you? You don't care about people, Hud. You don't give a damn about them.
Granddad.
Oh, you got all that charm going for you, and it makes the youngsters want to be like you. That's the shame of it, 'cause you don't value nothing. You don't respect nothing. You keep no check on your appetites at all. You live just for yourself, and that makes you not fit to live with.
My mama loved me, but she died.
Why pick on HUD, Granddad? He ain't the only one. Just about everybody around here is like him one way or another.
That's no cause for rejoicing, is it? Lonnie, little by little, the look of the country changes because of the men we admire.
I still think you nailed him pretty hard.
Did I? Maybe. Old people get as hard as their arteries sometimes. You're just going to have to make up your own mind one day about what's right and what's wrong.
I probably shouldn't say anything after that scene. Even if you've never seen that movie, it kind of speaks for itself. Power of the writing, power of the acting. But Ted titled this session The Place of Literature, which at first doesn't seem central to this moment, but it also seems more important than ever. What I want to say here might seem a bit discursive and meandering, but I promise there's a point. I'm 47, and I'm not the target demo for the movie HUD, which I watched in graduate school after my father sent me a list of movies he remembered in his youth. But this movie and the scene we watched has always stayed with me and immediately came to mind when Trump was elected in 2016. I'm of a mind that there's been a little too much hand-wringing about this masculine identity crisis, even if to some degree I understand it. I grew up in Appalachia, and there were definite things that were expected of me as a man from that region. From the old-fashioned and chivalrous, like opening the car door for your date and honoring your mother, to perhaps what we might now call more toxic traits, where in our own families, to the sports teams my brother and I played on, there was a clannish obsession to sticking to and up for your own. My father was stoic to a fault, a trait my late brother also bore, though he was known to crack from time to time, and which I have, more or less, with no small amount of shame, not been able to uphold. Little by little, the look of the country changes because of the men we admire. The men I admired all my life were these two men. They bore their pain, emotional and physical, without complaint. But this also meant they also cared little or made a fuss over their successes. I am proud to say, much to my wife's chagrin, I have adopted this trait and rarely find joy in my accomplishments. My point is this. I was raised to believe that men who were leaders were not the loudest voices in the room. They were not boastful. They did not rise up on the backs of others. I don't mean that there was a blind allegiance or belief in some meritocracy, but I mean that your strength was reflected in your grit. To be more pointed, Trump was the guy in the locker room no one followed when and where I grew up, and he has now been elected president twice. I grew up among hard and proud people from a region he was widely supported in, and I continue to struggle to square these ideas of manhood that seemed indicative of that region, that indeed seemed widely ingrained, with this new strain of masculinity that has risen to the fore and been embraced. I do not have answers or even coping mechanisms for how we meet this moment, except that the work we all do must continue. We must ensure that stories, fictional and journalistic, offer us a truer picture of our neighbors and friends, and that through these stories we can find some commonality and, dare I say, community. The more we can make the ideals we believe in concrete rather than abstract, the more the government isn't the government or Trump, but the scientist engaged in curing your child of cancer, or their border agent who carries extra water for the migrants she meets. Perhaps we would draw nearer to the humanity we seem to have lost sight of and gain some sense that we are all one human family. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Antonio Ruiz Camacho. I'm a fiction writer, non-fiction writer, essayist. But for the purpose of this conversation, I think what you need to know is that I came to the States when I was 31 with 2 kids and my wife. Cynthia talked about being the daughter to immigrants and that she was born in Philadelphia. Well, I was the adult immigrant who brought children to this country. So that's how I approached my response to the topic of the day. The morning after the 26th presidential election, as he got ready for school, my younger son asked me if the result of the election meant we had to leave the country. He was 12 years old. He was only 8 months when he, his older brother, my wife, and I moved to America, as Americans love to call it, even though it's only one of 35 countries in the continent. An oblivious expression of exceptionalism that, following the results of the last presidential election, no longer applies. My family arrived on companion visas. I did on one of those for quote-unquote skilled workers, whose future, like everything else, is now in the air. Years later, we got our green cards and later became US citizens. I did in 2016, just 2 months before the election. The fact that my son was now an American citizen, that this was his country too, didn't matter. The son of immigrants, an immigrant himself, all he knew was that he wasn't sure if he could stay. I probably said something like, "Don't be silly, we don't have to leave. Don't worry about that." But I don't really remember how I did it. Blocking traumatic moments from my life and then probe my own memory to turn them into words is what I do. But I have no doubt that's what I said. Parents will always say whatever it takes to keep their children from harm. I would have said we could stay even if it wasn't true, even if we lacked quote-unquote papers or had deportation orders hanging over our heads. We live at a time where facts seem no longer relevant, but some facts are more irrelevant than others. Amid the vomit-inducing headlines we're drowning in again, what I think the most about is the kind of conversations families less lucky than mine are having right now. The great thing about coming to America is your capacity for wonder, your gullibility to believe this country is like no other, and your right to pursue your own happiness on this land is real. That is, until the country starts flirting with the idea of proving you wrong. Throughout its history, America has dazzled the world with its promise of leading us all toward a less anxious future. That's why so many of us come. That, and because America needs us, because nothing moves without us. And we might soon get a taste of what that looks like in real life. But America has also demonstrated repeatedly its craving for cruelty toward its own people, its relentless dexterity for self-harm. Such a wild, immature country still. Last November, my kids voted by mail. My wife and I are empty nesters now. My younger son has spent the last 4 years living abroad, pursuing his dreams across the pond. Shortly after moving to Europe, he hung an American flag in his living room. He's 21 now, the proudest American you can find. Every day, he dreams of coming home. I recently asked him if he remembered what he said to me the morning after the election in 2016, and he said he didn't. That's why we write out the words, so we can all remember them, even if those who said them don't or say they don't. Thank you.
Before I introduce myself, 2 quick questions. Here's the first question. What's Rachel Carson's best book? You don't have to shout out the answer. Don't shout out the answer. Think in your head. You got it? How many people said Silent Spring? Raise your hands. Cool. Rachel Carson's favorite of her books was her very first, Under the Sea Wind. It's gorgeous. It's about a 1/4 mile of North Atlantic beach. I want both books. Second question. I didn't know we could use visual aids, or I might have brought a visual aid. You've all seen Monet's Water Lilies, or reproductions, probably on a poster or a coffee mug, if not an actual museum. What are they for, those paintings? Who are they for, those paintings? Those are my 2 questions. I am Donovan Hone. I am what am I? A lapsed poet. I sometimes pretend I'm a journalist. I'm mostly an essayist. I'm a former editor, and I teach at Wayne State University in Detroit. And I'm going to be thinking today about, I'm actually going to do something a little bit audacious. I'm going to bring poetry into the conversation, since we were invited to talk about literature. But before I get there, I've been thinking about all the conversations we've been hearing, and they've been provoking thoughts, which is what I think they're supposed to do. I like the essay as a form. not because you get to seem fancy. I'm an essayist, not a journalist, because it allows you to dramatize your own conflicted thinking. It allows you to enact the process of sense-making. It allows you to be endlessly curious. It requires you to constantly be diminishing the magnitude of your own ignorance. I like it because I often have a hard time figuring out what I think. I did want to say quickly before I read my prepared remarks that I sometimes judge the essay category for the National Magazine Awards. I'm not allowed to talk about the deliberations of when you're on a jury for the National Magazine Awards. You're sworn to secrecy. But I think I can say that I sometimes, over the last several years, reading hundreds of essays published in magazines, have felt a bit frustrated by what I'm reading. I feel like we need better stories. What do I mean by better stories? I mean stories that don't necessarily play well on X, of course, but also I got tired of stories that play well on Twitter or Blue Sky. I think that social media has deranged the right, and I think at times it deranges the left. I think it's shaped, as we heard in an earlier conversation, activism. I think it also shaped literature. So I'm going to try to think about what makes a better story. The second to last time I got to work with the late, great Louis H. Lapham, who was an important mentor for me, I was writing about water. I often write about environmental topics. And he said to me, one note was, "Don't make it too dreary," which I think is important. Like he always wanted us to delight and entertain as well. When I'm judging, I was thinking about the judging of awards because although I can't tell you what we say in the jury rooms, we do write citations. I like writing citations. I mean, they're a thankless form. It's like blurbing a book, so you end up using gassy adjectives. But I wrote too that there are people in the room received them. So I felt like trying to think about what I want, the better stories I want, or what I think of that the literary essay, which has kinship with journalism, can do. I'm just going to do a little shout out. He's got a book out, I got to write this. Joe Clock's Lost at Sea documents with affection, humor, and quiet eloquence the precarious yet wondrous lives of the anchorouts, a community of waterborne squatters at the margins of San Francisco Bay and of the American economy. In magnifying this little world, collecting these voices, drawing these portraits, telling these stories, Clock adds shading, light, and humanizing detail to the national story of 21st century Americans struggling to find freedom, belonging, security, and a little makeshift grace. And then last year, I got to write a citation for VQR. The author of the essay is not in the room, but Paul Reyes is. So this is another thing I want to see in essays. This was for an essay by a writer named Nicole Grave Lipson. Bringing great tenderness and equally great honesty to a challenging subject in As They Like It, a 5-act essay about teaching Shakespeare's gender-bending comedies to teenagers while raising a gender nonconforming kid. Nicole Grave Lipson eloquently explores the shadowy forest of parenthood, wherein she learns to dwell in the conditional and affirm, in Shakespeare's phrase, the virtue in if. Those are notes I made on my phone this morning, and I apologize for being a windbag. Here's my prepared remark. On November 8th, 2016, I was teaching a class on essay writing at the University of Michigan. The next morning, I went to Detroit to teach Introduction to Creative Writing at Wayne State University, and this is the poem I brought the following morning, was Robert Hayden's Monet's Water Lilies. One more thought, which is in the summer of 2020, I had a book come out, a collection of essays, not a bestseller. And my friend Jeff Charlotte also had a collection of essays out that year, This Brilliant Darkness. And we ended up doing a book event together virtually with Labyrinth Books in Princeton. And the woman who hosted us said this wonderful thing. She said that she thought both of our books were guidebooks to attentive practices. I've stuck in my mind. I love that phrase. And then recently teaching essays in Detroit, I came across something that the essayist Brian Dillon says, which is that he makes a distinction between paying attention and performing attention. I'm going to try to perform attention for you right now. I always consider it wise to remain on good terms with the local ghosts. And the local ghosts that haunt the classrooms where I teach include a number of poets. Among them, Robert Hayden, 1936 graduate of Wayne State University, then known as Detroit City College. I first encountered Hayden's anthology pieces, Those Winter Sundays, The Middle Passage, as an undergraduate. But it was only after arriving on his home ground in 2013 that I spent time with his collected poems, and there's a poem in there Monet's Water Lilies, from the final sequence of 1970's Words in the Morning Time, about a painting at the Toledo Museum of Art, mourning as in grieving. And I've taught this poem many times and keep coming back to it. It begins prosaically, like a lineated diary entry. Here's the opening stanza. Today, as the news from Selma and Saigon poisons the air like fallout, I come again to see the serene, great picture that I love. Hayden doesn't tell us the date, but we can infer it from the reference to Selma and Saigon. It must be March 1965. Prosaic as these opening lines are, they imply much drama, counterpoising as they do the poisonous fallout of the news with the serenity of the great picture. Great gesturing towards its magnitude as well as its excellence, as if the latter might provide an antidote to the former. And yet, spoiler alert, as you read on, writing the shifts in register, you will arrive 2 brief stanzas later, not at remedy or succor, at least not at any easy kind of remedy or succor. The particular painting in the collection at Toledo comes from the late series of water lily paintings Monet began in 1914 and kept working on right up until the year of his death in 1926. That is how Monet spent World War I, in his garden, in Giverny, trying to paint the impossible things, quote, that troubled him, quote, such as water with vegetation undulating in its depths. You probably know Monet's late water lily paintings, if not from a visit to a museum, then from the posters and coffee mugs on which they've been mechanically reproduced. They've become so famous it is difficult to see them. Hayden does not try to make us see the one at the Museum of Toledo. He doesn't attempt to paint a lily pond in words. He might have, but doesn't. It is hard for poets to compete with painters when it comes to making images. If color and light and three-dimensional space are the essential media of visual art, language and time and consciousness are the essential media of literary art. Hayden teleports us to the gallery of the museum, but instead of describing the painting on the wall, he dramatizes in language the effect it has on his speaker's mind, a mind poisoned by the fallout of the news. The first few times I read the poem, the second stanza puzzled me. It is a kind of riddle, or a series of riddles. It begins with this enjambed sentence. Here, space and time exist in light. The eye, like the eye of faith, believes. You read that first line and think you've come to the end of the declaration. Here, space and time exist in light. But then the next line qualifies the noun light. What kind of light is this? A kind of light like the eye of faith believes? Why is the viewer's eye like the eye of faith? And the riddle continues. The seen, the known, dissolve in iridescence, become elusive flesh of light that was not, was, forever is. We are far now from the diaristic lineated prose of the first stanza. Hayden is speaking in riddles, and he is speaking in iambs. To solve the riddles, I sometimes ask students to imagine a blackout. What would you see if, while looking at Monet's painting, all the lights went out? You'd see nothing. If there were some ambient moonlight coming through a window, you might see the dark square on the dark wall. Monet's painting seems luminous, but its luminosity is an illusion. It is elusive, not elusive. The paint reflects, but does not generate light. To see the light that shone on a lily pond in Giverny a century ago requires, therefore, not just any eye, but an eye of faith. Monet performed a kind of incarnation, making light flesh. The light that fell on Giverny a century ago was not this light, this elusive flesh of light, but it did fall on Giverny a century ago. And unlike the Daily News, it, through the miracle of Monet's painting, endures. That is the sense I make of Hayden's riddles. But the poem does not end there. In its third and final stanza, it resolves the drama of its first stanza. That opposition between Monet's serene painting and the poisonous news. And in so doing, the closing lines suggest what it is the poet loves about the painting and what it is he seeks when visiting it one day in March 1965. It ends like this. O light beheld as through refracting tears, here is the aura of that world each of us has lost. Here is the shadow of its joy. No joy. Only joy's shadow, only grief. And now here we are in the winter of 2025 in Tulsa, encountering a poem about the poet's encounter in 1965 with a painting by an elderly French painter who, decades before, in a garden during time of war, encountered light on water and beheld it as through refracting tears. And if you're me, Hayden's closing lines will haunt you, and you will keep returning to the poem that you love as if visiting a museum in Toledo. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. What I love about a gathering like this is that there's a thread that leads everything together, and as the ideas develop and sort of snowball, things become apparent. I'm feeling heavily reminded of something Siva said this morning: we're all dissidents now. Something Sterling said: no one's going to pay us either way. And also thinking of, again, Siva, this is a paraphrase, not an exact quote: what we do might matter in 20 or 100 years, if not the next 4. And that is a great place to pick up, Donovan, from what you have just shared with us. But also to pivot a little bit to, again, something Sterling said at lunch about journalism being the last thing to go radical, and thinking about artists as dissidents. And ultimately, for me, like thinking about the efficacy of the work, and that we are not all journalists at ProPublica who see policy change as a result of our work. Some of us are working in fiction, as painters, as showrunners and filmmakers. So I just wanted to ask the panel, like, how do you approach this idea of the efficacy of your work in a time like this? And are you thinking about it at all? And does the next 4 years bear on your work very specifically, or are you just doing your work knowing that it will be there 20 or 100 years from now, or trusting that it will be there?
It's a big question.
Take just a piece of it.
I don't know that you need to think about it one way or the other. And what I mean by that is, I think if you want to think about, let's say, going after the administration head on in your art, I think that's the right answer for you. And if you don't, I think that's the right answer for you. I think, I said to Ted last night, if you were at the concert when Michael Shannon got up there and did his cover, which came out of nowhere, and Paul came over to me at one point, he goes, "This thing is off the hook now, man." And, I said this to Ted and he kind of laughed, but to me, like, that moment and that concert last night was about the transcendent power of art. I had a teacher, Richard Bausch, used to talk about this in class, and he would say, you can go to ancient Greece and you can see the ruins of those buildings. He goes, that's what's left of the politics. He goes, but you pick up the Iliad, and Hector comes home, and his son doesn't recognize him, and he takes that helmet off, and his boy runs into his arms. That hits you the same way today as it did the ancient Greeks. That's what remains of art. I mean, that to me is the goal. I can't really worry about if I'll be read in 20 or 100 or even next week, quite honestly. But I think the goal is to try to create something permanent that speaks to the moments that we live in. When I was a young teacher and I really had no clue what I was doing, I would listen to this podcast from these professors at Stanford to try to figure out how to talk about Macbeth. And podcasts were very early. And these guys, I forget their names now, but they said, you can study the history of a civilization and we can see how they lived. We can study history, we can see how they governed themselves, and we can study the anthropology, we can see how they lived. But it's only in literature do you see those two things come together. This was like a general ed freshman population class, but they said, but this is the thing that's important to remember that can never be overstated, which is that literature is meant to be beautiful. And I think that if you are an artist in this time, I think our goal is to try to create something as beautiful and as true as possible that speaks to whatever community or idea that is precious, and I mean that in the most sincere and earnest way possible to you, and to try to give that. Because I think we all agree, because I think hard about this kind of political moment we're in, I think we all agree, regardless of how this election went, and regardless of how we feel about how people voted, I think a lot of people feel hurt and neglected. And I don't think we've figured out why. And I think we just have to keep doing the good work that we do and hope, as Peter said earlier, you hit that 170 million people, something in their solar plexus.
Well, Antonio said that we write things down so we don't forget them. Sometimes we also write things down because the people who said them may have forgotten what they said. I think that it is, for the record, art is about making something beautiful. It's also about the preservation of a feeling and a moment. And if I write something today and it sells tomorrow, that's great. I make a little money and, I have readers tomorrow. But really, I'm thinking whether it's journalism or fiction, I'm trying to capture the essence of something. In fiction, it's not always fact, but there is a truth. And I think that is what it's about. It's actually more important to me that I add to the archive and help build the record, and that what I make exists in 100 years, much more important than, whether it's on a bestseller list in 3 years or 4 years.
Yeah, I think it's important to tell these stories because they will matter in the future. It was very interesting to me how all of us wrote about this topic from the perspective of the day after the election in 2016, not this past election. So that tells you that processing history as an everyday occurrence takes time. And I think that's something that storytelling does better than probably day-to-day journalism. And it's something that I personally, as a journalist, most of my career was a journalist, was frustrated with, that you can parachute into a story and then report on it very quickly, and then you have to move on to the next story. But the lingering effect of those events is very hard to capture in journalism, unless you follow a family or a group of people for, 20 years and see the effects. But I think fiction has that power, or poetry to that effect. And I think it's an act of resistance just to keep voicing those stories, especially about communities that the powers that be want to erase from the discourse. I think it's important to keep giving voice to those stories and those people who don't have that voice, or if you are that voice, to resist the urge to become invisible out of fear.
I just taught some Montaigne a couple weeks ago, and I sometimes think about, because I'm teaching a graduate essay course, the 16th century in France. Maybe you could call that a slow civil war. It's a pretty hot civil war between the Huguenots and the Catholics, the bloody religious civil war. I haven't read anything else written by a French person in the 16th century besides Montaigne's essays. I think that the pressure for writers to feel like your writing needs to change the world can diminish what writing is for and can do. I'm about to teach Baldwin's Everybody's Protest novel. Not everything needs to be a protest novel. Not everything needs to be protest journalism or protest poetry. We can have both. I think we want some of those. I think it also can be enough for writing to make you feel a little more sane and give you, and if you're lucky, your readers, a fuller sense of what it is to be a human being in America in 2025.
And just to follow up on what Antonio said, I think that literature also has the unique potential to revive the voices that were erased. Those of you who went to Greenwood Rising, we learned about the boy who a young woman accused him of assaulting her, and that ultimately led to the fire. And the person giving us the tour mentioned both of those people just sort of disappeared. We don't know those stories, but writers of fiction can develop that story, and there's an emotional truth that you can kind of arrive at by imagining a story.
Thank you all for that. I'm also thinking about the fact that we seem to be in an era now, suddenly, somewhat expectedly, where the rules don't apply. What it means to be a politician or a president has changed so radically. The lies of the administration are a type of fiction. They are building a story. They are telling a story. I was lucky to spend time in my work with Barry Lopez, who was mostly an essayist and chronicler. And he spoke a lot about reverence being the object of the work, of a reporting, entering a community of art, of reconnecting a human being with whatever you want to call it, the sacred, the lifeblood, the thing that moves us and makes us human. And he did a much better job of that than I'm doing now. But it was always moving to be in his presence when he spoke in these ways. But I'm also thinking about there is a time and a place for reverence, and maybe that's all the time, but irreverence has a certain power as well. And in this moment, and I'm thinking of Wahini Vara, who writes an essay that's published in The Believer about AI, which she co-writes with AI. And this is the first time I think AI has been mentioned this weekend. So that is also creating a new form of journalism, of art, of storytelling, to write a personal piece in conversation with an AI. So the question here, if there is one, is like, when the rules are broken, when writing about beauty, as Cindy has said, is a motivation, that's a motivation for art to reflect beauty. When something that Antonio said about the opposite of, doing the work would be to resist out of fear. I'm building up to a question here. It's that, how do we balance the reverence and the irreverence in the work? Do you even think that's part of the challenge at this moment?
The first thing that came to mind was, remember what Sterling said earlier about like being honest with the stories that you tell and portraying, if you're writing about a specific group of people, like in my case, I mostly write about like wealthy immigrants coming from Mexico with no intention to become American citizens, like resenting the privileges that they lost. Just try to be as truthful about the communities that you write about. And that comes with writing, making them full characters. Everybody's a complicated person, right? But I think over the years, there's been this tendency here to write about like relatable characters. And I think that's something that's really harmed our storytelling abilities because we don't want to offend somebody. I don't know if we should take back any storytelling control of our own stories, I don't know, is to be fearless about how we portray our communities and how we represent ourselves as characters in storytelling and be reverent about that. I come from Mexico, a place where you grow up taking for granted that politicians lie, that if the government says the price of X is coming down next month, well, people would rush to the grocery store that night to buy X because they knew that the price would go up. It was just the opposite, right? I think we have to mature as a country here in a sense of like losing that quintessentially American innocence in believing everything that somebody says just because they are powerful, right? And learn to distrust that. But that comes also with the freedom of being irreverent, of engaging the powers to be in that kind of conversation that doesn't have to be too tactful about offending somebody's sensibility. That comes with maturing as an audience, but also as storytellers.
We learned in the last session about the Sausalito boat population, which was so fascinating to me, and also this little 1-year-old boy named Maverick and his 12-year-old friend and his parents who loved Tulsa. And there's so much complexity in those stories and in those characters. And as Sterling also said, there's light and there's dark. You can't have one without the other. And I try to think that is the primary thing that I keep in mind as I'm writing a story. And in order for me to see that the very best in a person and the very worst in a person, I have to be able to see that in myself, the best and the worst in me. And that happens from story to story to story. If I have a character who seems outwardly evil, I have to see the other side of them. I have to see the good in them. And that is a deeply moving and transformative experience and painful to see those things in myself. And so that, I think, is what I will continue to keep in mind through this time, as I continue to write.
I'm going to try to add something. I don't know if this is an answer to your question, Jennifer. So I didn't mention in introducing myself that just before the pandemic, I agreed to try to write a book about gardens. And then the pandemic happened and everyone was writing about their gardens. So I'm having a little bit of a hard time. But I've been thinking about gardens, and I think about gardens as metaphorically suggestive. I don't think you need to have an estate in France to have a garden. I don't think you even necessarily need to have a backyard to have a garden. But I think they're meaningful to me. I think we need them as sites of freedom and curiosity. So I'm thinking of when I'm teaching these days, I felt that my students and I were a bit poisoned by technology during the pandemic. So we do a lot of writing in journals. And I think of the journaling, the semi-private. They know I'm going to read it, but they can say things there rather than to the room. I think of that as a kind of freedom. And I think that it can be thought of as its own kind of resistance. What we decide to pay attention to and how we try to decide to pay our attention and to what. And I would like to pay less attention, frankly, to what's happening on X. And I'll just leave that as a synecdoche.
One thing I just wanted to add, picking up on something that Mike said, I think that question of beauty is one that I hope we can all kind of carry away and think about a lot, because it really strikes me that one of the main tools of this administration and of this movement is this kind of trafficking in ugliness, and that there is this kind of instinctive impulse to respond at that level and to try to connect at that level. And I'm struck by how there's this kind of devaluing of everything that comes out of that. And the discourse turns into this kind of awful bickering back and forth, this division that feels like it's really ripe for the picking then. That people do feel isolated, they feel alone, and that sense of community just goes away. Questions from the crowd that I can bring the mic around to you.
I'll just follow up on your question, Ted, because I also wrote that down, Michael, and I was like, oh, this is the word I was hoping we should have said earlier, which is beauty. And to turn it back to you, because I think it's very easy for a lot of people to associate trying to make something beautiful with fiction or poetry, which is sort of declared art, but you're both fiction and nonfiction practitioners. And my question is how you think about bringing beauty into the work of not just nonfiction, but also of even writing to this moment. How do you bring beauty to accounting for the ugliness that's being put into the world?
Wow. Thanks for the easy question.
You brought it up.
That's true. My answer is a little bit meandering. I have young kids that are 6 and 8, and they're engaged in like youth sports and this little suburb of Columbus we live in, and I coach my son. I won't let anybody else coach him in basketball, so I always coach him in basketball. But what kind of cracks me up about when we're at these sports fields that I've been thinking a lot about over the last 4 years is that every kid in that community, on every field, their parents make them go tell the coach thank you after the game. They make them go up to the referees and they say thank you. And then I tell my wife, I said, think about this. 50% of those people are going to vote for Trump. She goes, that can't be true. I was like, it is true. I mean, that's where we live. And I've had a hard time trying to square all these things, as I'm sure many of you have. But I think a lot about that because I think a lot about what I was talking about in my talk is the abstraction of everything. The government is abstract. You know, my brother was a chemist at the FDA. He used to get so upset. I've told several people this already. He used to get so upset when they do these government shutdowns because the senatorial staffs would be declared essential personnel. So McConnell would declare his staff essential and they'd get paid and then he'd have to go home on furlough. And they'd turn the FDA into this sort of political football and it would just drive him nuts because they just wanted to do the work. And so I've thought a lot about in my essays and in my fiction that, because I also grew up in this region of Appalachia that's always been mischaracterized by everybody, including people like J.D. Vance, right, who purport to be from there. The beauty is in the personal thing. There are plenty of people, there are plenty of kids I've coached, there are plenty of parents I've interacted with. I'm sure they voted a different way than me. But you see how much they love and care for their children, and we've allowed these abstractions to get in the way of that sort of human element. We're always kind of struggling to be this human family in a certain sense, and I think that's where the beauty is. And I think it's hard, like when you read Jeff's book and Ted tells these stories and Peter tells these stories, like it's hard to see the humanity in those people. But the way I kind of look at it, which is maybe a little bit goofy, if we're not going to do it, I feel pretty confident they're not going to do it. So I have to, right? We have to. We have to find what the thread of humanity is there, because it doesn't seem like it comes the other way. And it's hard because it feels like we are always the ones giving grace, but it's never given back to us. But maybe that's our plight. I'm not really sure.
I love the question because I think it's a question I want us to be able to ask and affirm and attempt to answer. That's a hard question. What is beauty? It's the question, it's in every creative writing class. But I want us to be thinking about beauty in nonfiction for sure.
So I wanted to ask you not just about the place of literature, but the use of the techniques and mindsets of literature and what place it has outside of those forms that you guys practice. So in the run-up to the first election with Trump, I was an editor at the New Republic, and we had a group we knew we couldn't get access to the candidates and that they weren't going to say anything interesting to us anyway. So we hired poets and a philosopher and novelists and sent them to different campaign events and had them write. They brought a unique sensibility to those kinds of stories, largely because they were alienated from the process of political journalism. They didn't know the tropes, they didn't have the context, they didn't know who to get in touch with. I had to schedule everything for them, all that kind of stuff. But the articles I thought were fantastic. I will say they didn't have a great impact. I think the biggest impact out of that series was the poet Trisha Lockwood. After she published her story, went on the Twitter feed for TNR and tweeted, "Fuck me, daddy." That was the biggest impact we got out of the whole thing. But I wonder what the panel thinks about the idea of using your techniques as literary practitioners outside of the realms of literary work.
I was a Knight Wallace Fellow after I finished my MFA program with TED, and the pandemic started. And I was really thinking about then coming out of, an MFA program and thinking about fiction for a couple of years, thinking about how to amplify the voices of my characters, and could I tell stories in their voices rather than me writing about them. And so I had worked with audio, but I worked with audio a lot that year and combined illustrations and audio to do a kind of graphic storytelling. And so I was interested, I had started looking at graphic novels and considering the power of illustration compared to photographs. What can an illustration do that a photograph can't? It can leave out some things and highlight other things. So I played with that with illustration and then also voice. I left my voice. Initially, I was going to put my voice in. I was more familiar with the traditional 3-minute radio story, which I'd done, but I kept my voice out completely from those stories and used just the voices of my characters. And these were people who had housing insecurity and food insecurity in San Francisco's Mission District. That sort of literary background is informing my reporting in that way.
I sometimes by accident do environmental journalism. I do mean kind of by accident. So I wrote a book called Moby Duck. One NPR headline summarized it as "Former school teacher chases ocean trash." Did not much like the headline. But it was really just that whole book was driven by the essay, beginning with questions. In that case, you find a toy on the beach. Where did it come from? Where did it go? And just following it. I try to bring that to the kind of thinking one does in an essay or in a poem. In poems, you're playing with registers of tone. You're playing with musical implication as well as other kinds of implication. I want nonfiction to take us on a journey of the mind. And I do think even like when I'm trying to do journalism, I'm thinking about that, the essay or the story as a kind of poem, not just as a narrative. That's my best attempt. I don't do anything besides read books and scribble. So
to close this out, Antonio, I wonder if you would field this. It strikes me that you not only use the tools of literature in this way, but you're often dramatizing the work of journalism. And I think that there's something really kind of intriguing in that kind of space that exists between this notion of journalistic practice and then essentially using fiction to show us what lies behind that, the things that we don't see in the making of those journalistic stories.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been discussing today is like how we reach out to an audience and how to make all the work that we're doing have an impact, right? And I think sometimes we are overly obsessed with fact in journalism, which is obviously very important. But I think it's as important to deliver an emotion and make our readers feel something. What they are going to feel is not up to you. And that's the fiction writer in me talking. Like your duty is to deliver an emotion, to make your readers feel something about your characters. What they are going to feel, that's none of your business because they complement the dialogue. They bring in their own experience. But if you think about creating or seeking an emotional connection with your work in journalism, you might have a greater chance to connect with your audience as opposed to just having the hard facts and trying to be as neutral as possible.
Thank you all, as always, for being here, and thank you to our panelists again for a wonderful journey.
Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper, Cass Ali, and Aaron Wald at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to the Church Studio.